Okay, hi, this is Reason is Evidence, and I want to apologize first off. Hold on a second. I want to apologize first off here. I know it's grainy. I know my technology's bad. I'm not good with computers. I'm not a particularly eloquent speaker, and I do apologize if this is a little tough to follow. I'm standing, supposed to be making my kids dinner, but I wanted to do a quick, for me, video. But I do want to apologize. It's tough to follow. I'm not eloquent. I'm not I like to watch Stefan Molyneux's videos. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but I don't disagree with everything he says either. One thing I do like about Stefan Molyneux is I think he's an extremely eloquent speaker, and I envy that. I wish I had that flow that he has. I'm going to turn the coffee pot off here. But I don't, and so I do apologize if this is difficult to follow. This is going to be hopefully not too wordy. I'll try to get, I did practice, I'll try to get all my points out. I wanted to make a quick video. The problem with atheists, quite frankly, is they just don't think enough. We've all had this problem. We just need to think a little bit more about our assumptions. That's the problem. We need to think a little bit more about the things that we assume are true. And it would behoove us to spend more time sort of sitting down, spending hours sort of thinking about our assumptions, making sure they're rationally consistent before we talk. And that's what I try to do. This has to do with the burden. The whole burden of proof argument is it's a weak argument for atheists. It's just weak because it's really it's kind of sophism. It's a way to shirk the debate rather than actually defining one's assumptions and defending them. And I've said this before, I've alluded to it a little bit. This is sort of a response. I was watching a Stefan Molyneux video, and it was about burden of proof. And the thing that struck me is the willing atheist, for people who appeal to reason and rightly criticize institutional religion, Christianity in particular, and rightly criticize them for their inconsistent assumptions, don't spend a whole lot of time examining their own, and that's a problem for them. Again, the whole burden of proof argument is pretty much sophism. The first reason is, well, okay, I'll get back to the Stefan Molyneux, but the first reason is that it's sophism is that you can't believe in, there's no negative belief. So you say, I don't believe in something, that's not an argument. You have to say, okay, what do you believe? So for example, if you say, I don't believe in God, that's fine and well, but the question I would have is, okay, what is your existential definition? Like, how do you define reality? And then where does that take your, like, what are your axioms? What are your maxims? What are your premises? What are your irreducibles concerning the definitions of man, reality, objectivism? How do you define man? How do you define man at the epistemological level? What are the axioms about his identity? That is the only way you can really have an effective argument against God, because essentially when we talk about God, we're talking about a creator, right? He who, or that which, is necessary for everything that we observe and claim that we can know as sentient human beings can exist. So we're talking about existence. So we really need to go back on how do you defend your reality without God? Okay, so what are your axioms? To sit there and say the burden of proof is on you, well, the burden of proof is on anybody engaged in the argument, okay? The burden of proof is to prove that your definition of reality, what you consider objective reality, that your axioms, your irreducibles with respect to man, his metaphysics, particularly his epistemology, how he knows what he knows, are rational, that there's a consistent thread of reason that is unbroken within them. So everybody's on the hook for explaining their metaphysics. In every argument, the only one who is inevitably right, the only one who is inexorably, ineluctably, absolutely right, is the one who can appeal to reason at the very root level of existence. I mean, I firmly believe that. Otherwise, it's really semantics, which is why I'm a pretty big libertarian. I don't like to get into debates about many things, because most debates will not ever get nearly close to being completely resolved, because they don't approach the irreducibles with respect to what is man and what can he know, okay? So that's the first thing. Now, what we need to do when we talk about what atheists need to understand is that when we talk about reality, we're talking about identity. The identity of man. The idea that man is a self-aware being who is fully capable of knowing himself and is able to apprehend the physical. Himself is a being who is aware of self. The epistemology, man can know his environment. He can know himself, he can perceive the environment, and he can make rational judgments about it. Man is capable of knowing truth, okay? And my computer's doing something really wonky here. I hope it doesn't come out on the videotape. I'm going to pause this just for a second. Yeah, my computer's getting really... Okay, let's see if that works. All right. So it's about identity. So when we talk about beliefs, it isn't about the person who has... If you say, I don't believe in God, the burden of proof is on you to prove that there is God. So this guy comes on Stefan Molyneux's show, and he has a question, and his question is, well, isn't the burden of proof on the person who, if I say I don't believe in flying pigs, isn't the burden of proof on the other person to prove to me that flying pigs exist? That I don't have to accept I don't have to accept that there exist or can exist flying pigs unless he appeals to my senses, or he makes an empirical argument. Again, the question, it's not really about that. It's not about... Okay, when you say... Let's see if I can explain this. It's about what we can believe. It's not about what we see empirically that defines what we know. It's not about what we can see with our senses. It's not about, so I don't believe in God because I haven't seen. I've seen the evidence. Then it goes back to what is evidence? What is your definition of reality? If I can present you a reasonable argument, do you need to see it then? If I can show you that my belief in God doesn't destroy the identity of you, would you concede God? And that's really the fundamental root of it, is not what can we see so that I can believe it. It's what can we believe that doesn't destroy the identity of man. Okay? The idea that man can be himself, that man can actually exist as a self-aware, actual agent who is capable of making real judgments and apprehending real knowledge about his environment. That is, he is able to be himself and he is able to apprehend truth. That's man's identity. So the question is, what can we believe that doesn't destroy his identity? Period. That's the only question. You don't have to see things to believe them. You just need to know that the thing I believe in can exist in such a way that doesn't destroy your identity, that doesn't destroy the identity of man. So, for example, he said, well, I don't believe in flying elephants. So let's take that as an example. All right, well, when you say, first of all, you have to define the thing that you don't believe in, okay? What definition are you using? So are you saying that you don't believe in flying elephants because they'll destroy your identity as a human? Or you don't believe in them because you've never seen them? So that's the difference. You need to distinguish between what is why don't you believe in it? Okay, so if we say I don't believe in flying elephants because that thing wouldn't have a definition that's compatible with my identity, with reality, with the idea that man can know truth and be himself. So say I don't believe in flying elephants because I don't believe you can have an elephant that is also a bird. That's a pretty rational argument. I don't believe in a bird elephant because the idea of bird and the idea of elephant are mutually exclusive. Okay? So an elephant can't both be an elephant and a bird at the same time, just like black can't also be white. You can't have black which is also white because you've destroyed the concept. If you destroy the concept of black and white, of elephant and bird, then that wrecks man's identity, because if man isn't capable of making a real distinction between bird and elephant because they're both in neither, that destroys man's epistemology. Man can't possibly know reality because we're saying that reality fundamentally is rooted on a contradiction. That contradictions can be true. If contradictions are true, then they're no longer contradictions. So you have this kind of thing that you believe. You don't believe an elephant can be a bird because if man believes in a contradiction, it destroys his ability to know reality. It destroys his epistemology, which destroys his metaphysic. Okay? So that's a good argument. But if you say, I don't believe that there could ever be an elephant that could fly, well, why not? Just because you haven't seen an elephant that could fly? A flying elephant wouldn't necessarily wreck your identity. If somehow, genetically, we crossed an elephant with a bird and big enough wings and the elephant could fly, you may have to qualify it as a different kind of elephant, a different species of elephant or whatever. I'm not a zoologist, but you'd have to qualify it differently or label it differently. But if it actually existed, it wouldn't wreck your epistemology. So say, I don't believe in flying elephants because they're impossible, that's a completely different argument. I mean, whether they're impossible or not isn't the point. The point is that they could exist without necessarily wrecking your identity. If you would have to qualify, you couldn't say it's an elephant, you'd have to qualify it differently, but there you go, a flying elephant, okay. The problem with atheists is atheists always want to qualify, or they always want to categorize God as being something you can't believe in, fundamentally not because there isn't any empirical evidence, because observation is not the root of truth. Reason is. So again, it goes to, what do we believe? What can't we believe? Because we believe it destroys man's identity. And that's what atheists are trying to say, but they never really say that, either because they're not thinking their ideas through, or they want to throw out the burden of proof argument because they don't really want to debate the issue. So what you're really saying, atheists, if I may be so bold, is you're saying, whether you know you're saying this or not, this is what you're saying. You're saying, I can't believe in God because to believe in God wrecks my identity. And I would say, that's not true. What's your definition of God? You would have to, if I can give you a definition of God that not only doesn't wreck your identity, that if he existed wouldn't wreck your ability to be you, nor know anything, nor it wouldn't wreck your metaphysics, it wouldn't wreck your ability to know things, to know truth, it wouldn't destroy you epistemologically, then you would have to concede that God is possible. That your disbelief in God wouldn't necessarily be a rational belief, because for you to argue that your disbelief in God is actually rational, you'd have to show how God wrecks your identity as a human being. And that means you have to define God. So, if you limit your definition to a God, for example, I agree, you can't believe in a God that controls all things, because that wrecks your identity. If God controls all things, he controls every molecule, then every thought you have is a direct extension of God's power, which means there's no you, because every thought you think, even your perception of you, is in fact really merely a function of God's power. So you're removed from the equation. So you can't be you in a universe that exists with a God who controls all things. If you have a God who can make the past the future, if you have a God who can make a square triangle, then you're believing in a God that wrecks man's identity, because man would have to concede that truth can incorporate contradiction. If truth incorporates contradiction, then truth is both true and not true, which wrecks your epistemology, which means you can't really know truth, which means it wrecks your metaphysics, which means you can't really know you. So you can't define you because you can't know anything. But that isn't, I would argue, a rational definition of God. So you have to understand that when I say the burden of proof is not necessarily on the people who believe in God. The burden of proof is on you. The burden of proof is on you to show that the only definitions of God which are rational are the only definition of the God which are, I don't want to say rational, the only definitions of God which can possibly exist are those definitions of God which would necessarily destroy man's identity. And I'm saying, until you can do that, you don't have an argument for your atheism. Your atheism is just another opinion. It's not based in reason. It's not based in evidence. It's not more rational to be an atheist. Particularly if someone can come along and give you a definition of God who, again, doesn't destroy your identity. So if you have a God who doesn't contradict your identity, who doesn't contradict himself, then the belief in God is exceedingly rational, meaning the belief in God is every bit as rational as your disbelief. The burden of proof isn't on the other person. The burden of proof isn't on you. The burden of proof is on me to show, for example, the burden of proof would be on me to show that not only is man's identity and his ability to apprehend reality and truth not wrecked when we incorporate God, God is necessary for man's identity, then I could show that your disbelief in God is irrational. if you can show me that God is not unnecessary, not superfluous, but destroys man's identity, okay, because, well, I guess if you could say that God was wholly irrelevant, I guess that would destroy God, because if you try to bring in God, you can't incorporate something that's utterly irrelevant into something that's relevant. So yeah, if you could prove that God was utterly irrelevant, if you could prove that man has a consistent identity, which can utterly exclude God, or a definition of God which destroys man's identity, then that would be a legitimate definition or a legitimate argument for atheism. The problem with atheists is that you guys aren't really a whole lot more rational or smarter than Christians. It's or religious people. You guys are kind of cut from the same cloth. You want to debate the particulars. You want to use the sort of sophist arguments from your side. You know, they want to preach intelligent design. You want to preach science, but no one really wants to talk about what are the things nobody ever really wants to get down to the nitty-gritty about the definition of man, his ability to be himself and his ability to know what he knows. And are the things we believe consistent or inconsistent with that identity? And that's the atheist fatal flaw. So I just wanted to briefly touch upon that because I look at atheists and there is a hubris among them, at least in my experience. Just like there's a hubris among Christians. It's not, again, you're cut from the same cord. It's not a big difference. I was a Reformed Protestant Calvinist for 15 years, and I know the arrogance of assuming you're right. Not being able to accept anybody else's idea and thinking everybody else is a fucking idiot. And I see that in atheists all the time. I'm not defending Christianity in the orthodox sense. I'm not defending definitions of God which wreck man's identity. But in the same way, I'm not going to support scientific empiricism if I can show that it does the same fucking thing. Scientific empiricism, which says essentially that man is a product of an objective reality outside himself, destroys man's identity because it makes man mutually exclusive to reality. If man's a function of reality outside himself, then man is not real, okay? That's just a brief overlook. That's just my brief take on scientific empiricism. So the real argument then is not, I don't believe in flying elephants. I don't believe in giant octopus. I don't believe in a porcupine crossed with a unicorn. That's not the argument. The argument is, what are beliefs that we just can't hold because they wreck man's identity? We can't believe that God controls all things. We can't believe that black is also white. We can't believe that a circle is also a square. You know, the proverbial square circle. We can't believe, again, this is another one, we can't believe that the singularity before the Big Bang was infinitely hot and infinitely dense, because once you qualify a concept with infinitely, you destroy the concept. So infinite heat, for example, is heat with no reference. It's a heat without beginning, heat without end, which means there is no observable effects of heat. So you can't observe heat to be efficacious to anything because heat's infinite. So the whole concept of heat is destroyed by qualifying it with infinite, which means there's just heat. So the definition of heat becomes heat. A concept can't define itself. So I would say an irrational scientific belief would be that the singularity before the Big Bang was infinitely hot and infinitely dense. Well, you've just destroyed the concepts of dense, and heat, which means you can't possibly say it was infinitely dense and hot, because once you've qualified it with infinitely, you've destroyed the concept entirely. There's no such thing as heat. There's no such thing as infinite heat. Because if you can't observe heat to effect anything, if there is no rational effect of heat observable, which would take something outside of heat would need to affect something. You would have to have a reference for the heat. If you have no reference for heat, then heat can't be defined. It's irrelevant. So there's a scientific belief that I would say is like believing in a square circle. Believing in infinite heat or infinite density is a contradiction in terms. There's no such thing. Infinity plus anything else is impossible. You can't add something to infinity. So there you go. There's a scientific belief that's like believing in a flying elephant from an atheist point of view, to me. So as a person who believes in God and denies the infinite heat of the infinite singularity, you saying to me that the singularity of the universe was infinitely hot and infinitely dense is the same thing as me saying I believe in a flying elephant. Or I don't believe in a flying elephant. So when you say that to me, I hear flying elephant. Okay? So we've all got work to do. We haven't really discovered the true nature of reality because we're always wanting to incorporate these impossible beliefs that wreck man's identity. Christians do it with God. Science does it with their presumptions and their Platonist ideas regarding the laws of physics which govern and all of that kind of stuff. So what we really need to do is we really need to get rid of the contradictory ideas and really need to focus on the things we believe and how can we incorporate them in a way that doesn't wreck man's identity. That's the whole argument. Everybody's on the hook. There's no burden of proof. If you want to disbelieve in something, there's no such real thing. There's no such thing as a not. You believe something. You believe in a reality that doesn't need God. You need to define God, and you need to prove that all definitions of God destroy man's identity. And if you can't do that, then you need to concede that there's a real possibility that God does exist and could be incorporated into reality in a way that makes reality necessarily dependent on God. That's not an irrational belief. So, I'm sorry this has gotten a little bit long. I got to get the kids dinner. But I wanted to make that statement because it's just one of those things that that frustrates me to no end. This whole burden of proof argument is such sophism. It's just bullshit. An atheist says to me, burden of proof, I walk away. Because I know that's an atheist that just hasn't thought through their assumptions, doesn't have any axioms, doesn't have any irreducibles that are really worth a damn. Burden of proof is a cop-out. If you want to engage the debate, figure out what you believe, think about it long and hard, make sure it's completely consistent, don't bring in paradox, don't bring in contradiction, get a consistent worldview, take it all the way back to the seeds of the very metaphysical definitions of man, his ability, epistemology, irreducibles, all those things, then engage the discussion. Don't come out with the burden of proof because you're doing the same thing the people you disagree with do. They're just resorting to the idea that before we can debate, you have to agree with me. That's the whole burden of proof argument. You got to prove that. All you're saying is you basically have to agree with me first that your definition of God is irrational before we can have a debate, which of course renders the debate moot. If I have to agree with you first, if I have to concede the burden of proof is on me, which means I have to concede your definition of reality and all of your metaphysics, then there's no sense in having the debate because I've already conceded your side. It's just sophism. So think a little bit more. Let's get the conversation going. Let's have it intelligent and reasonable. Let's not resort to contradictions, sophism, mysticism, demagoguery, ideology. Come on, guys. We can do better than this. You can be smarter than you are, and I can be smarter than I am. We can all be smarter about this. And have a great night. And that's all I have to say.